by the University of Colorado Ethics Committee and the University of Colorado Center for Bioethics and Humanities. I'm Jackie Glover, co-director of the Ethics Consult Service at the University of Colorado Hospital. And with my colleague Julie Sweeney and some committee members from the Ethics Committee, we plan these ethics grand rounds. And every year we have one devoted to research ethics. And you have joined this month's ethical issues in managing pragmatic research using the electronic medical record. Before I turn it over to Dr. Matt DeCamp, who will be moderating this session, I want to remind you our next session is Thursday, June 9th, and we're going to be talking about open chart, open results, and the ethical implications with Dr. C.T. Lin. So I hope you will enjoy and comment in the chat with questions or comments. And Dr. Matt DeCamp, who is at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, will moderate our session with Dr. Thomas Flaig. Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm super excited to be here today and to moderate a discussion between Dr. Thomas Flaig, who's Vice Chancellor of Research, but also practices in bladder cancer and prostate cancer, and also does research. And the way the session is going to work today is we're going to have a short presentation from Dr. Flaig for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're also lucky enough to be joined by John Heldens, who's the director of the Colorado Multiple Institutional Review Board. And after that 10 or 15 minute presentation, we're going to have a moderated discussion. And through this discussion, I would say that anyone who's interested in putting a question into the chat, we can bring those questions into our conversation at any time. I have some prepared questions that we'll go through, but we look forward to your participation as well. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Flaig.
Well, Matt, thanks so much. And Jackie, thanks for your invitation and welcome. And I'm really glad to be here today. Let me share my slides. Is that projecting okay? Looks good.
Looks good.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. I think this is a really interesting topic. And I have to say, as we've developed this idea, and I've pulled on a lot of my friends and colleagues to think through it, we're really trying to do something pretty different here. I think it's forward looking. I think there's a lot of advantages to this in terms of trying to do a trial, essentially embedding a clinical trial into the electronic medical record. The potential to be easier for patients, easier for providers and the researchers, less impact on people's schedules. But there's also a lot of practical and I think some ethical parts to think through on this. So this is a pilot project which we've been working on for a number of years. And again, I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly. If people want to chime in, I think feel free. I don't know how best to do that, but if you want me to stop, I'm happy to stop and address these as we go. It's a randomized pragmatic adaptive trial of metformin for glucose intolerance or increased body mass index in prostate cancer patients. Sort of a mouthful there, but we'll talk about that a little bit. A little bit of background of this concept. So we're trying to merge a couple things together here. Metformin is widely used for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Those is clinical practice see it used regularly. It is a number of off-label indications. In clinical practice, we use drugs off-label quite a bit, including in this case for the prevention of diabetes in people with certain types of obesity. So medical practice, the implementation of metformin for these off-label indications has been pretty variable. And again, I see some patients coming in on these drugs for these off-labels, other patients aren't. And there's also been a variety of retrospective reviews, large data sets. I'm going to give an example here, but there are many. There's maybe a half dozen of these, where you look at prostate cancer patients who happen to be on metformin, incidental use, who do better in terms of their prostate cancer outcomes. So that's always been another little part of it. So again, the use for people in pre-diabetes and also this supported use in prostate cancer patients. So this pragmatic trial will look at test the feasibility of enrolling patients who have either a hemoglobin A1C of 5.7 to 6.4 or an increased BMI to more than 25, and randomize these to pragmatic trial to either metformin and lifestyle modification versus lifestyle modification by itself. So essentially identify these patients, give them a consent, and run this trial in that way with passive data collection through this So for the purposes and the scope of this project, it's really basically feasibility to see if this could be implemented in a limited number of patients with prostate cancer. Again, there's a tie into a possible prostate cancer benefit as well. Let's see if I'm able to advance. Yeah. So here's one example of those retrospective studies I mentioned. So as I said, there's been a number of people who looked at large data sets. This is a Canadian-based study. They looked at patients who are 66 years and older with diabetes and a diagnosis of prostate cancer. So just essentially took diabetic patients. The median age was 75. There's over 3,000 patients. What they found that is there's some associations here. So there's an adjusted hazard ratio for prostate cancer specific mortality, which is 0.76. And this was based on the amount of use of metformin as well. There was an association with all-cause mortality, which was significant, but that did decline over time as well. But a clear signal from this, and again, many of the studies showing a potential benefit in prostate cancer to using metformin. And I'll show this relatively quickly. I think can you see my cursor all right there? Hopefully you can, but you can see the hazard ratio for metformin is decreased, but not necessarily for other treatments in diabetes. Again, this is held from other studies. So it's not a diabetic association, but perhaps an association with metformin specifically. So here's the proposal: to test the implementation of metformin treatment in prostate cancer patients with obesity or impaired glucose tolerance. So that the study would largely be conducted in the electronic medical record. Patients would be identified and screened in EPIC. You'd look for certain factors, the diagnosis of prostate cancer, certain eligibility factors, including BMI and so forth, that they're on My Health Connection, which is important, My Health Connection, MHC, and they're seeing one of the involved providers. Eligible patients would be, as I mentioned, consented in My Health Connection. Metformin would be prescribed. There'd be about 20 providers which would be trained in the study, and these order sets would be fronted to those patients. Data would be passively collected. So we wouldn't do ECRF forms or the other things we typically do in trials. We would gather data passively through Health Data Compass, our Health Data Warehouse. So the primary objective here is to assess the feasibility of a randomized pragmatic adaptive trial, looking at the accrual of 200 patients in 2 years. We would measure that by signing of consent, and I'll talk a little about 1 and 2 in a bit, but this would be on consent 2 or 3, which actually start this part of the trial. Now, I'd say there's a lot of secondary objectives. I'm not going to go through these actually, and I think of the most recent memo, we're going to trim these down just a little bit before we start the trial, but there's a number of effectiveness. So again, efficacy, how will this metformin work? Effectiveness, as a lot of us understand, is a real world assessment. We're looking at a number of things related to adherence, implementation, and effectiveness in that regard. Here's a schema. So I've talked about this in words, but just want to maybe spend a little bit of time on this slide. So initially consent, we're initially going to offer a consent to all prostate cancer patients. There's essentially a 2 consent process. The first one is to any prostate cancer patient who's got an account in My Health Connection. Do you want to be part of a prostate cancer consortium where we'll contact in the future for studies, we'll screen your medical chart to see if you meet eligibility for studies and give you a chance to do this called a consortium approach. If patients say no to that, they go over off to the side, so to speak. They're not involved in this trial anymore. If they say yes, they'll then immediately be screened for this trial, for example, this metformin trial. Is their BMI more than 25? Do they have any of their exclusion criteria? Is their creatinine adequate, things like that? If those are yes, they're then randomized to either metformin with lifestyle or lifestyle by itself. They sign then consent 2 and 3. So that's specific to this metformin study. If they're on consent 2 and randomize that side of metformin, the next time they see one of those 20 investigators that are trained, let's say one of my patients signed consent, they came to see me in clinic, and we get a pop-up saying this patient's consented to the metformin study. The provider would then have 2 steps. One would be to say, hi patient, do you recall entering the study? And you can discuss their awareness of study, consent, and things. It gives you a face-to-face to go through that, answer questions about the study. The second thing is I'll do a check. Is this good medical practice to start metformin? We've done screening for all these different sort of things, creatinine and so forth, but I'd look at the patient, make a final decision, and then enroll in the study. If that happens, the metformin data set, order set comes up, order metformin, and you're gone. If you're just a lifestyle, you do the confirmation about enrollment, understand the trial and so forth, but metformin isn't started. The lifestyle information is sent out to the patients. There are some nudges that we intend to send out annually to check a PSA, which is good medical practice. These patients with prostate cancer being followed should be checked at least once a year with PSA. Also, some other things based on metabolic condition, hemoglobin A1C, and some other metabolic parameters around that. So that's the basic scheme of the study. A 2 consent process would be a key thing. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but there's a lifestyle modification arm. This is informational. We're sending out information through the My Health connection within the patient portal around that. And the metformin, pretty standard dosing around this. Providers have free will to change this. There's some recommendations about starting at 850 and going to twice a day, but the providers can modify this, discontinue this, go to a higher level, depending on the situation and so forth. So we just start them, and it's based on clinical practice and standard of care to continue that. I'll say a little bit about this. So patient data will be collected in an incidental manner. As I've mentioned, there's no ECRFs and so forth. We'll do manual chart reviews, particularly the first 50 patients for questions, just as we monitor the study, but that'll mostly be for oversight and learning around this. There's a steering committee that's already been in place, involves medical oncology, cardiology, endocrinology, research administration, and biostats. That group will meet quarterly and look at aggregate safety data, which Health Data Compass is pulling. I've given some examples of that here, and look at that in aggregate on a quarterly basis. Reports, I should say, AEs of special interest include death, hospitalization, cardiovascular, CV, cardiovascular outcomes, myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, cerebral vascular accidents, these cardiovascular things, new diagnosis of diabetes, that's important, any incidental metformin-associated lactic acidosis. The data safety monitoring report, the RB, will then be sent reports based on those meetings. I'm not going to go into this, but this just shows some of the background of what for the programming has been done with UC Health, who's been a great partner in this. And obviously COVID has sort of stopped all of ours activities, some of theirs and so forth, but we really worked through a pretty elaborate way of thinking, can we do this in the EMR, which has been, I think, quite gratifying. One of the things, and this is my last slide, I believe I want to touch on, is that we've done this. The idea was not just do one center with one group, but could we do this across all 3 regions of UC Health? Could we do it across specialties? I'm a medical oncologist. Urologists see a lot of prostate cancer patients. Radiation oncologists see a lot of prostate cancer patients. So we've worked hard to have geographic diversity in different regions and also specialty diversity in different specialties involved. So with that, unless there's any questions, I'm going to stop sharing my slide and turn things back over to Matt.
Thanks for that amazing summary. And yeah, as you said, you went through it quickly, and there's a lot there. And before I get into some of the more detailed questions about particular ethics issues, I actually wanted to get John or yours initial comments about the relative uniqueness of a study like this. I mean, I can say, yeah, I've not seen or heard of studies like this elsewhere. John, from the standpoint of COMERB, did this strike you as being like a unique thing that's not going on elsewhere? Or, what was your initial reaction to this?
It's definitely unique here. And I've been involved with sort of a national study many years ago that was sort of remotely conducted that failed because of, it was so passive. But I think using the electronic medical record to help conduct a study and reach out to subjects is very unique, and I find it intriguing and exciting. And another unique piece of this is that Dr. Flaig reached out to me and others very early on in the planning stage to discuss feasibility and to work through the details. And this all took place before the application came to COMERB and the Cancer Center. I think it's an excellent model of collaboration where regulatory personnel can work with researchers and others, everybody involved, and make the best use of all of our time, I think.
Tom, do you have any sense of that uniqueness?
I was presenting at a external advisory committee for the CCTSI a number of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And they give us feedback, like what are the strengths of our campus from an outside perspective and so forth. And one of the reviewers said very specifically, you have a setup here with your EMR and your bioinformatics. And I think, frankly, the nature of the conversation in the ethics community, I think they actually mentioned that I think your IRB is someplace where you could think through, as John just indicated, how to approach it, something like this. And they give us a lot of encouragement to say, you should try and do a trial within the medical record. And the hospital representatives were there and different folks, and they said, you should go after this and try to do it. And their point was, we need to lower the barriers for research involvement. In other words, if someone decides they want to be involved in research, we could fit this into their normal care routine when they're coming in anyways and so forth. It's easier for providers and patients. And so that was sort of the impetus to do it. But at least from that external advisory, they felt like it was quite unique. And we've been working on this for, 3 years or something, maybe even more than 3 years. And part of what happened is COVID in the middle of this thing, obviously, but we're getting a lot of traction now as things have settled down. And I hope we have it open to accrual in coming months.
No, that's great. It's great to hear. And maybe now to turn to some of these more discrete, particular ethics issues that I think people may have questions about. And again, just to encourage folks, if you want to chat in questions, we'll bring those in. But I want to start with what I think I understood to be the first contact from a patient or a potential research participant's perspective. And that, I gather, is recruitment that occurs via a My Health Connect message. Is that correct? And if so, how did you, maybe start with you, Tom, how did you start thinking through that first recruitment message?
I mean, I think one of the things that I didn't have as an initial thought, but we developed at the right time, is the idea of a 2 consent process. And this was going back to John's comment. I was sort of thinking about, we want to do a randomization and saying, well, that's pretty complicated. So how are we going to do that? We want to do it virtually, so to speak, or electronically. So we went through this. What developed is the idea of inviting people to join a consortium, right? What does that mean to join a consortium? What would be the advantages of doing that? What would be the pros and the cons of that, and so forth? We knew at that point we had seen what both the IRB and frankly the hospital on the UC Health side had done with regard to the biobank and electronic consent for that. So we frankly, I was involved in that, I had watched that. We took really the approach that was taken there about fronting a consent with this idea and used that general approach. The hospital had programming, the UC Health had some programming around that. And we had some experience in that and sort of that. And one thing we did do is make a video. So there's a video when patients first see this. And we had a focus group. Bethany Kwan and Julie Martins and some folks helped us get a focus group prostate cancer patients together and talk about, how would you like to be approached this? Are you open to this? And they like this idea of joining a general group to be known that we're going to look at your criteria and see if you fit, and then to get a specific trial offering after that. So I think that we built on the experience of the biobank consent and learned from that process, which was also known to the hospital. We use this idea of a video. If people were more perceptive, that we used a focus group, actual prostate cancer patients here, who interacted with My Health Connection to get that. And then I think the last thing I'll say is we're going to monitor this and see how it goes, right? I think the other thing we'll be pretty humble about is we may have to give more background. We might have to modify the video or whatever else it is. We're open to that.
John, how does COMERB think through these recruitment messages through My Health Connection? Is it just reviewed by the IRB? How much does UC Health get involved? Because this necessarily involves the EHR. Could you get a sense of how COMERB looks at these recruitment messages through the patient portal?
It's a collaborative effort. UC Health is by necessity directly involved, and we work with them directly. We have a good working relationship, and they were involved as well from the beginning. So they have a committee called the Patient Experience Committee that would have to review the messaging going through My Health Connection. The IRB, it was a bit of a curve for us. I think the providers on the IRB saw My Health Connection, years ago as this is strictly a clinical portal. Should it really be used for research? But I think as we got more and more examples, and I received one message from a patient at one time that got contacted outside of My Health Connection, but explicitly said it would have been better to contact me through My Health Connection. They would have felt that it was more private and easier to act upon. So I think it can be expanded.
I was going to ask you a follow-up. I imagine there may be PIs or even PRAs on the call who could be interested in designing these kinds of messages or writing them. Can you give us any sort of a sense? What does a message look like? What does it include? Who signs it when a recruitment message comes through MHC?
Yeah, so one of the advantages of recruiting through My Health Connection is it's coming from an individual. It's coming from a provider, a nurse. I can see that as a patient, who's sent me this message. And beyond that, the message is very similar to a recruitment message you might otherwise send. So there's nothing terribly, unique there. It needs to be short. it can provide a consent, it can link. So it's a good first contact. And I'll say there are actually many studies already doing just this. They do have to work through UC Health and through the Patient Experience Committee and COMERB or an external IRB at this point. But it is happening, and it seems to be going well.
And recruitment, we often think ethically is the first step in informed consent. So I think that naturally leads us to talk a bit more about the consent process for a study like this one. And Tom, turning to you, there is this multi-stage consent that happens. And could you say more about that? But in particular, I'd like to hear a bit more of the why. Like, why was it developed to start with the consortium and then have these different steps in the consent? So could you answer that why question?
Sure. I think one thing that was very apparent to us when we started in this is that we wanted to use this as a pilot, as an institutional pilot. We wanted to learn as much as we could about, is this feasible? What's the burden on the hospital, on Health Data Compass, us as researchers? I mean, is this going to be feasible just functionally? So one of the functions we want to look at is randomization. We thought if this moved forward, one of the powerful things, again, that came from that external advisory board feedback years ago, is that you got to try to push that aspect of randomization to really fully see if this is going to work. So if you want to randomize, you're going to do this electronically. I think one of the things, again, we go back to some early conversation with John and other people in the IRB, is it's a little hard on the gate to give a randomized sort of here, you're randomized XYZ. We felt better, and John might have the better nomenclature around how to describe this, but the idea of the invitation to join a consortium in which we would look at your features as a patient and present trials to you, including trials in which you've been randomized to a particular arm. So it seemed easier for communication. The why was the easier for the patient to say, okay, I'm in a consortium. As part of that, they may look at studies and give me one arm of a study, and I'm expecting that now because I've been prepped in this thing. I've been able to think about it, and there's a second step, sort of break it down for patients. So I don't know if that helps you think about, is that responsive, Matt?
Yeah, and John, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so this, going through the My Health Connection, the idea was patients would be provided a consent form. And as many of you are familiar, if you provide them with a 30-page consent form, we're not sure this is going to get off the ground, right? So we thought a lot about how to simplify the consent form. The ethicists on the call are probably familiar with an old process called Zealand consent, where you randomize first and consent second, and then you just consent to either arm. And there's some serious ethical problems with that. Several years ago, there was a paper published about trials within cohorts with this, which is a nuanced version, which is being used here, which is you get consent to be in the cohort. You get consent to be asked to be in other trials, and consent to be randomized before you get that second consent. And then consents 2 and 3 in this study they have a paragraph about the entire study. So the patient's still informed that this is a comparison between lifestyle and metformin, but you're in the metformin trial or you're in the lifestyle trial. And the consents end up being much shorter and easier to read at that point. And I think lend themselves to more success, hopefully, in this consent format where there's not really a discussion up front with a researcher.
And was consent in this case, there's some great questions coming in the chat that I'm going to turn to, but it was consent in this case entirely electronic. Can you drill down on that a little bit?
The consent, both consents will be electronic through My Health Connection. Again, kind of building on the apparatus of the biobank. And one of the parts that was important to me, before the patient is enrolled in the trial, there's 20 investigators. I think I showed names actually at that last slide there. We're going to train on this trial in a pretty traditional sense. And you could argue there's different ways to do pragmatic. What if we want to do a more general thing beyond just a specific kind of cancer? And that's, again, I think we should think through that. But in this case, we're going to have a site initiation visit, going to meet with those investigators. We're going to train them on this trial. And then the orders or the ability to enroll a patient is just going to be for those 20. So again, I see a patient, I was in clinic this morning, so it comes in as a pop-up, then I can confirm with them. You sign a consent and you've been randomized to metformin arm. Do you recall that? Oh, I recall that. Yeah. Do you have any questions about that? No, I understood that. Well, can we add this to your understanding? And all right, I can check a box screen saying that I've confirmed that. So even though the consent there, you get an in-person chance to reinforce that or confirm that. And then of course there's a medical check, Matt, so you say there's good medical practice to proceed, but so it is all electronic, but there's this in-person sort of last step, which we felt was important.
And that seems to me as a really important feature, a safety measure, so to speak, we might call it, for consent. John, was that part of the consent, that in-person part? Does that meet part of the regulatory requirements for consent, or was that really something that was ethically important to do above and beyond what we would think of as the regulatory requirement for consent?
It's an interesting question. What are the regulatory requirements for informed consent? And this goes above and beyond. And when you dig down to what the regulatory requirements are, it's legally effective. The subject has an opportunity to consider their participation, and the consent is obtained in a manner to minimize undue influence and coercion. And I would say the electronic consent process meets all three of those very clearly, but ethically, is it still informed? And you don't know. And so I think that final check with the provider filled in that last gap for the IRB. Yeah.
Great. No, thanks for clarifying that. I saw a question in the chat that related back to the issue around MHC, patient portal recruitment, and sort of volume of messages, multiple studies, multiple teams, confusing, overlapping recruitment messages. And maybe just to ask a concrete question and get your thoughts on this general issue around volume. Is volume of messages something that either CoMERB or UC Health looks at? If I were designing a study, is there some chance that they would say, well, not yet to do MHC messages for your study because we already have a bunch going out? So maybe to start with you, John, and the idea around competing studies, competing messages via MHC.
It's definitely a concern. We don't have good data as of yet. It was a big concern during COVID, right? As you can imagine, you have a very defined population being contacted repeatedly. And in that context, we had a little bit of an opportunity to help researchers connect with one another and minimize the amount of contacts. It's a concern at UC Health. The advantage we're in is that we will be able to get some data, I think, going forward. And I think UC Health is in fact thinking about this in case it becomes a problem in terms of whether patients can have an option, for example, to say, don't contact me anymore, but that's in the works. I think in practice, it doesn't happen anywhere close to as often as we think it might happen, but definitely something we're keeping an eye on.
And you're referencing specifically the idea that a patient potential participant clicks an opt-out button to not be contacted?
The concern that one patient will be contacted multiple times for studies. Thank you.
And then Tom, maybe your comments on this idea of we know there are competing clinical trials, especially in areas like oncology at times. Does the idea of someone who enrolls in this study becoming ineligible for another study or competing with other studies, was that ever part of the discussion?
I think that's one of the aspects we have to watch. If we think about the pilot nature of this, it's really important. What I've seen from my other perch, so to speak, is that there are certain patient groups which of which there's a lot of interest in study, right? So I think John mentioned COVID. I watched there's a limited number of COVID patients when everything started 2 years ago. And how do you sort of think about, and we set up some committees to actually sort of organize that. There's other special patient populations which the research community is organized around that sort of thing. I think we're going to have to be aware of the impact of this. I know, again, UC Health, I don't think it's formally represented, but they're very thoughtful about this. I've had conversations about it. It's important for them. The other thing I just add is that during the pandemic, the use of the patient portal and things like that sort of skyrocketed, right? And so I think, thinking of this is from a provider point of view, or maybe perhaps the hospital, it's very important that becomes a useful means for patients. And that if a research message becomes so frequent that they check out of the Health Data Compass, if they check out of the patient portal, that's a bad thing. It really can't happen. So we've got to guard against that. My own sense is that there's probably enough room for a lot of these. There's going to be special groups, special cancers perhaps, or special conditions of which there's a lot of research interest. We may have to organize ourselves around this.
And this actually leads me into another question that's in the chat, and it related to informing the patients, clinicians, about the study. And the question of, well, what counts as a COI on the study? I put my clinician hat on and I imagine, what if this were a study about blood pressure medications and a patient comes in and they've been contacted by MHC and they're randomized to one blood pressure medication versus another. And now I, as the physician, am going to be the one to write for it. Does that make me de facto an investigator in the study? Am I part of the study? How was I informed about the study? Maybe again, to start with you, Tom, and then get John's thoughts.
Good question. Is one we thought about a fair bit. And I would say purposely, we picked a specific cancer with literally, there's probably those 20 providers looked at care for the vast majority of prostate cancer patients at the UC Health. So that was purposeful. We could essentially sidestep the question you asked, which is important one. I might defer that broader one to John. Like, what if this was a hypertension study? But for this one, I could say there's 20 known people. We're gonna have a site initiation visit. We're gonna train them. We're gonna only front these orders to those people that have been trained on the study. And so we could test a lot of things in this, but what it isn't testing, just to be clear, is let's say we're doing an asthma study, or we're doing a hypertension study, or lipids, or something else like that. What does constitute? And I think there's probably a model, and I'll defer to John, where people are not engaged in the research, but they're involved in some of these sorts of things. But that's maybe a broader question for us that this particular study won't help resolve necessarily. John?
Yeah, and maybe before to turn to John, so I can see what you're saying, which is that in this case, it was sort of very carefully constructed and thought out in a way that's consistent with the pilot feasibility sort of nature of it, to make sure that was an easier question to address.
And honestly, just to add to that, from the hospital perspective, I think in the IRB, then we said it's going to be a defined group of people. Again, if I were on the hospital IT, say, just wait, I don't want to have this go out to, you guys just starting out 1,000 providers. I said, no, there's 20, and you can put my name on those, because that helps actually, because I'll have talked to them all and it'll help refresh what this is about. So it was less of a risk for all of us and being kind of a confined experiment in that sense.
Yeah, great. John?
Well, the FDA, Matt, for your hypothetical question, would consider you a sub-investigator, because they define an investigator as an individual under whom's direct oversight a drug is dispensed or administered. So that was a concern. It came up early, and this model of basically having 20 co-investigators addressed that. So I don't have a good answer for any other model, frankly. So I think that addresses the regulations. Ethically, I think it's the right way to do it. It gives the opportunity for that provider to check in with the patient, as we discussed about the consent. But then there's also the issue in my mind of the success of the project and the success of recruitment. And if the provider that had to write the prescription had no knowledge of the study, I don't think that would help you accrue. Right? And so this model, again, all of this, I think, was developed through discussions and collaborations early in the process. It was helpful.
Were there discussions, Tom, engagement with these folks who were going to end up being on the study? And could you give us any sense about, what you did or what their concerns were and how they were addressed as you had these preparatory discussions?
Yeah, I mean, with the 20 investigators, 20 co-investigators. No, I think it's key. One thing I think John just pointed out again is we had early discussions, and I just remember those now, that we landed on this after thinking through that, right? How are we going to do it if it's different? Okay, and I think we said, well, we can train 20. That wouldn't be that hard. In the cancer center, in the prostate cancer clinic, we've done a number of trials across the system, collaboratively with investigators in the South region, North region of UC Health. We've done a number of ITs. So there is a standing relationship in which we've done more standard traditional clinical trials, and research coordinators on calls. We have a monthly meeting. We talk about trials across the system. There's the LAPS grant, which are federal trials. So in addition to those IITs we've done together, we've got federal trials, SWOG trials right across the system. So there's already a framework by which there was trust and familiarity with the people involved, which I think really helped. And then what I did a number of years ago, I went to a retreat, we had an annual retreat, talk about, and I said, now for something completely different. And I sort of launched into this thing. And there was a fair bit of excitement, but it was built, Matt, on an established relationship. I think if I'd never met any of my colleagues at North and South, there'd be a lot wrong with that. But if we didn't interact clinically or anything else, this would be it'd be almost impossible to do this. And I oftentimes say research is a great way to extend your relationship. It's hard to start the relationship by asking somebody. It's good to have a relationship with other people to build on with research. And in this case, we were fortunate to have that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's, I think that's clear from what you've described and the importance of it. One of the other aspects of ethics and research really has to do with managing risks and benefits. And as I recall your schema and the way you described this study, I actually thought there were some pretty unique ways that you managed the potential risks of metformin. And so and some of those seemed like they were almost automated in character. Can you say more about, this is it's a drug product. So there are risks of it. How did you manage risks for the study?
So a couple of things. There's eligibility criteria for this. It's a drug. You have to have a certain kidney function. You have to have you can't have a certain level of liver dysfunction. You shouldn't be on drugs that are contraindicated for this. So there's some electronic things that we can do to screen people for those things, right? We have an EGFR threshold. We've looked at it with UC Health, and we're going to use that when they screen the patients. We've got that human check, right? So again, after I confirm people are aware of they've signed a consent for the trial and answer any questions about that, or take them off the trial if there's some question. The next one, okay, Tom Flaig, you've seen this patient. Does this make good medical sense? Patients, they're consistent with drugs. There's no time. I go through it medically. So there's that in person. It's just not an automated thing. Then there's the order set that comes up will check for certain things, right? It checks the creatinine level if it's been a certain length of time. That order set that's generated, so that's automated. There are nudges that go out on a regular basis that say, you haven't checked the creatinine in a year. What we're going to say is you haven't checked the PSA in a year, which is what we should all be doing as patients. By the way, there should be a creatinine with that because they're on metformin. There's some things there. We've gone through with Health Data Compass, some of those key things that we look at. Lactic acidosis, for example. So we're screening electronically based on the ICD code and the lactate levels, the lab. So we have a couple of ways we're looking, anybody in this trial that might be in our system that has an elevated lactate or gets an ICD-9 code about that. We've got a multidisciplinary steering committee, endocrinologists, cardiologists, medical oncologists that are looking at this and thinking about it. And frankly, Cecilia Lowong, who's been critically important, is an expert in endocrinology. So she's the one that's helped to craft that in terms of a safeguard. Might be overdoing it a little bit now, but there's a variety of ways you try to think through this and the safety of the patients. There's quarterly reporting, as I mentioned as well.
John, what do you think about this idea of minimizing risk and maximizing benefits in a study like this one, again, from the IRB perspective? I guess one of my thoughts is I totally get it. You're doing a survey study or a biobanking study, perhaps even through MHC and the EHR. But once a drug product gets involved, I'm just speaking for me personally, it sounds like it's more risky, and I don't know so much about that. How does Comer view this?
Oh, I think we all would agree that drugs in general are more risky, but OHRP and FDA have, since the beginning of the regulations beginning of the expedited review categories, have allowed that there are some drug and device studies that may qualify as minimal risk. And so the IRB thought a lot about this, but thought with all the exclusion criteria and all the checks that this did qualify for minimal risk. That being said, this study will continue to go to full board, through its lifetime, just because of its unique nature. But let's be clear, this design would not be appropriate for investigational products. This design would not be appropriate for any drug products that have significant risks to them. You'd want to go through a traditional consent and talk with the patient and make sure they understand what they're getting involved in.
So it was important, it sounds like, for this study that metformin, obviously approved drug product, has long been approved, being used in a population, if I'm not mistaken, that I noticed these were people who have an abnormal hemoglobin A1C. So it is perhaps a population that might otherwise receive metformin independent of the study. Was that also part of the discussion?
Yes.
Correct. But less so, if I understand your comments, John, for something that's purely investigational, not yet approved. So that wouldn't happen this way. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. That would not happen this way, or an approved drug that was being used in a novel off-label situation, right?
And that's where the A1C and the comes in. I see there's another question in the chat. It says, does COMERB require a DSMB to monitor the study? Was that a COMERB requirement? Maybe it was something the study already did or had planned.
That was a joint requirement, and that came up early on. Again, I think we want to, there's some important feasibility questions going on here and some safety questions. Can we get the data? And so that seemed a prudent step to all involved.
I have one more set of area of questions before ending with some more general questions. And again, there may be things that come in the chat. And it's around that last ethics principle of justice or equity and enrollment. And one of the things that I think we've seen over time still, even with patient portal use increasing, is that there are certain socioeconomic, age, race, and ethnicity based biases as far as who uses a patient portal. Did this issue come up, or how do you think through conducting or recruiting a study in this way against a background where use of the portal itself may be unequal?
So this is something we thought about a fair bit. I'm happy to take that one first, and John can chime in too if you'd like, but we thought about this a lot. I think it's just what you articulated. We want more equity in research, and is there a chance the way we do this will actually cause the opposite effect? One of the other limitations is that My Health Connection is an English only setting, for example. So there's not the website itself. We can put a translated consent there, but there's some limitations to the actual website itself as it sits right now, which is a factual thing. It's an English only website. So what I'd say the Cancer Center's PRS is another group in which we went through and had that scientific review, and we talked about this issue explicitly. What we decided to do, at least in the interim, is enroll the first 50 patients or so, just to make sure that we've got the basics right, that the fundamentals of this are working right, and then to look at the demographics of that at that point and say, okay, now, for example, a Spanish language consent. What's the status of that? How do we work that? We're an English only site. How do we and work through these? But we asked for the first 50 patients just to work through the nuts and bolts of how this is working, then to make a concerted effort to look at the data demographics and make a plan with them. So that's one of the requirements we've agreed to, and I think is a good requirement, to look at equity over a variety of different measures. We can, and the interesting thing here is we can look at urban, non-urban. We can look at academic versus non-academic. We can look at, I think, age, race, ethnicity, a number of different things in that regard. But that's the approach we're taking current. And I'll just say as an aside, it's one of the things I've been concerned about. If this is a new way of doing things and things are going this way, I think they are, we certainly can make the equity issues worse through this means. And we'll need to think about that carefully.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely an IRB concern, right? Equitable selection of subjects is something we think about with every study. A couple other pieces. My understanding from EC Health is that in February 2020, about 64% of the population was using My Health Connection. In February 2022, it was up to 86%. So, you know, we can take some comfort in that. Still, we need more information about demographics and such, and non-English speaking use, for example. And I also, Tom, I understand that within the oncology population, there's a generally higher use of My Health Connection. So we have that, but this does get us in position to get data, which I think is important, because, you know, we have concerns and they're legitimate, serious concerns, but I think having some data from a trial such as this, we could get data from the Personalized Medicine Biobank about diversity of enrollment there, and they're watching that very closely and trying to, you know, improve there and just.
I thought it was a really important point, and something I didn't know, Tom, that, or hadn't thought of at least, and didn't know, was the idea that, yeah, you can send out a consent in a different language, but if the rest of the platform is not in that person's preferred language, then it still creates potentially a barrier to get to that first recruitment or to that consent message. I think a really interesting point. I wanted to ask maybe a specific question about this notion of opting in and opting out for those recruitment and consent messages. I could imagine a scenario where someone gets a message and doesn't want to be recruited or contacted in this way, and they opt out forever. Or there's a time delimited opt out. You opt out for the next 6 months or a year. Or it's an opt-in on the other end of the spectrum, that you opt into receiving these messages. John, is there any conversation at a high level about those kinds of questions?
There is a conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. I have the same concerns. You have to be very careful what you ask and what people are opting in or out of, right? I think it's also important to keep in mind that the health system doesn't fully control this. I can through Gmail silence, a stream of messages from anybody, and that's completely outside of all of our control. So I think I'm glad that they have a patient experience committee, because I think having a group that really thinks carefully about how a patient would receive some of these messages, the IRB thinks about those things too, but maybe having more patients involved looking at that sort of stuff is indeed important.
And as we get closer to the top of the hour, again, to encourage folks to chat in if they have questions, but maybe to ask Tom, you a question, looking back through the process of designing this particular study. As you look back, are there things that you wish you had done differently, or lessons you've learned now that if you were doing this again, you would say, well, next time we're going to do it this way to better meet what we think of as the ethical requirements for research? Anything looking back?
It's a good question. I mean, we made a lot of mistakes. It's hard to describe them. I think one of the things we did right, though, so I'm going to turn just a little bit, is John and I talked really early. We had interaction with the IRB chairs very early. This consent issue, that wasn't my first thought at all. We actually looked at a few different models structurally. We said this idea of doing the provider in-person check was something that came out of those discussions. John's alluded to the fact that we're going to do a subset of patients. So I think the most challenging part of this, the part that we eventually got right, was make sure we had a good conversation with the hospital, again, who's been a great partner, with the regulatory, because there's so many different parts to come together. I think that the part I didn't understand is just how darn complicated this is. And we've been working on this over 3 years. So there's just so many, from IT to biostats, to the regulatory, to the hospital engagement, to all these different, the coordinator level, the provider, there's just a lot of things to it. So the one thing I'm hoping to get out of this is that, again, if we think this is an institutional pilot, we'll work on this for 4 or 5 years and figure out how to do one of these, figure out if it's feasible, but then hopefully have a paradigm for how this can happen, understand what the capacities are for us to do this, the interest, then perhaps grow those capacities over time. So maybe an early mistake was not having a broad enough group. Just when we first started, we pretty quickly said, all right, we need to have these people at the table. Let's have a standing committee once a month. And so we didn't make that mistake very long. We got a pretty broad group of people together, which is the only way we've gotten to this point. I hope the trial opens in the coming months. I showed you that schematic of all the different programs that's being done right now. And then we'll launch this, which will be pretty exciting.
John, what about you looking back? Are there lessons learned that you have taken from this planning process that you think carry forward or maybe applied in other studies?
Well, I think pretty early on, we were thinking about this as building infrastructure for the future. And it was more complicated than I think any of us appreciated. And for those of you who think about, it's one thing to send a recruitment message through My Health Connection and a consent form, and that's fairly straightforward. But if you want to actually obtain consent in My Health Connection, the EPIC team is central to that. And they have to be involved. And things as simple as reconsenting become complicated, because now technically, electronically a new consent needs to be uploaded and substituted, and that takes a certain amount of time. So I think at the end of this, if there's some infrastructure that can be used going forward, that could be very, very valuable. You
mentioned reconsent. I hadn't even thought about that. Could you say a little more? That seems like a really important point. There may be changes during the study that require reconsent.
Yeah, and also I mentioned that this study design wouldn't work well for an investigational product. It also would not work well for any complex study design. I think the study design has to be pretty straightforward. So I'll go back to the biobank as an example. They've had to reconsent several times, for various reasons. And it can be done, it's successful, but there are other stakeholders involved. And so there's just more steps to take. With this mechanism, you have more subjects for one than you would ordinarily in a normal trial. There's, and you need more messages to think about. When they do reconsent, it's immediately electronic, and you have it, and that's great, and you can get data on who has and who has not, and who hasn't even opened the consent form. So the biobank, for example, they can look at who consented, who explicitly declined, and who looked at the consent but's done nothing, for example. And that's useful information as well, and it can help you follow up.
I see that. Yeah, that gets to that question of how the message is, who they're reaching and what they're doing with them, because you can actually in a fine-grained way know who opened, looked, did nothing. Very interesting. I see there's a question in the chat, and maybe it's not directly related to research, but it is this question about other languages in the patient portal and the structures for that. I don't know the answer to that question. Do we know if the actual structure of MHC is considering other languages rather than the messages themselves, or either of you know that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can comment on that. I think as I've talked to the hospital, they obviously see it as an important issue too, and I think it's something that they're thinking about. UC Health is thinking about that. The one thing I just say is that during the pandemic, I think a lot of the things everything maybe got put on hold in some regards. But my perception is that all involved think it's an important issue, and I agree with Jackie's comments.
John, anything to add?
Yeah, this is another experience we've seen from the biobank, and that is that patients do in fact take the time to make decisions. So there's a sizable population of patients that have read the biobank consent and explicitly declined. So I think the notion that anybody would just automatically say yes and be in the study is not true. I think patients are taking the time to read these, or they also may take the decision that I don't want to take time, I'm just not going to do anything with this message. So I think they are exercising their autonomy, if you will, through this news.
And I maybe have one last question, and there is time if people want in questions. And it came up just with what you were saying, and I was imagining, how does someone withdraw from this study? Obviously, they could withdraw by simply stopping to take the metformin. If they're in that arm, they can vote with their feet, so to speak. But also, if a lot of the data are being collected in the background or via the EHR, what does withdrawal look like for a study like this one?
I'll take a stab at that, and John can chime in. So essentially, if you're going to run a 200 patient study with a drug agent, you need many coordinators to do that. We're not going to have many coordinators. We're going to have likely 2 coordinators that are checking, mostly doing encore linking of exams, linking of visits and so forth. So there's not going to be a lot beyond that. I think the way we've crafted this, the protocol, and I haven't thought about this in just a bit, but my recollection is that we have that coordinator's number, that contact information. Individuals can contact that coordinator. I think my name is there as well. And then that would be the mechanism by which we take them off the study. Then the back end, we do a data, depending on what they've withdrawn from, whether it's taking the drug, any use of the data, these sorts of things, we do it that way. So again, it's a largely embedded, automated, but there's still a human connection for patients. I think one of the main things the coordinator is going to do is the linking and so forth of the visits, the first visit, which needs to be linked, and then answer questions that come up for patients and deal with questions such as this.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of things. One, the consent's in my health connection, and so it's if the patient remembers and takes the step, they can access it. The second is that it's common standard practice that if you're, this applies mostly to the population that signs the first consent. They're in the cohort. That's everybody. But if a follow-up message were to be sent, another study were to come up, typically we require an opportunity, it's something explicit for the patient to say, hey, if you want to withdraw, all you have to do is respond and tell us. And so that opens the door. Again, through the biobank, we have some experience that actually works.
Great. Well, I see we're really at 3 minutes to the top of the hour. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I've learned a lot just by hearing from both of you talk through this study. I don't know if there are any additional questions in the Q&A. Jackie, I can turn it back over to you to close up our session if there aren't any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Drs. DeCamp, Flaig, and Heldens for a wonderful conversation, as Dr. Williams says. And please join us next month, June 9th, for a continuation of EPIC conversations, but the ethical issues in open notes, open results, including ethics consult notes, which has been a challenge to the ethics consult service. So thank you once again, and see you next month.
Thank you all.
Bye now.